Hi everyone. As Emma said, I'm Kevin Merry and I'm the Head of Academic Development at De Montfort University in Leicester. Welcome to my presentation, which is entitled Keeping the Cheese in the Sandwich, Ensuring Learner Mastery During Virtual Learning and Teaching Sessions. So this presentation is essentially about how myself and my university maintained important elements of our universal design for learning approach to learning and teaching following the COVID-enforced move to remote teaching. So there are no real cheese sandwiches, unfortunately, as part of this presentation. I wish there were, but all will become clearer as to what that means as we go through. So my university, De Montfort, adopted Universal Design for Learning in 2016, largely in response to our exceptionally diverse community of learners, which you can see on the screen there from that infographic. We felt that a one-size-fits-all approach to supporting learning would not be effective given the diversity of our learners, and so our solution was to provide a learning, teaching and assessment framework that takes into account the diverse ways in which learners learn. And that particular framework was Universal Design for Learning. For those of you that don't know that much about UDL, I'll just spend a minute or two defining what it is. So UDL is a design framework that takes into account the variable ways in which learners engage with and approach with learning. Those variable approaches are best summed up by three learning networks in the brain, which actually map across to the three UDL principles, which are engagement, representation, and action and expression. Engagement is about how learners get interested and motivated for learning. Representation is about how learners perceive information related to their learning. So this would encompass things like learning resources and materials. And action and expression is about how learners demonstrate their understanding. So this might link specifically to assessments, both formative and summative, but it might also link to things like checking of learner understanding on a session-by-session basis. Now, the idea is that we can better support learners to become expert learners if we provide options across these three principles. So an expert learner in the UDL sense is a learner that not only is able to master learning content, but also a learner that is able to recognize how they personally approach that mastery of learning content. So some learners will master learning by listening to lectures, reading journal articles and taking exams, for example. But other learners may actually master their learning content in a very different way. They might prefer to work with their peers, solving problems. They might prefer more multimedia type resources, and they might prefer to, say, verbalize their learning rather than to provide a written output. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about this idea of the cheese sandwich. The cheese sandwich is effectively an approach to instructional design. So this is how we supported our staff at De Montfort University to design learning and teaching sessions that had UDL at the heart of them. And the cheese sandwich is based on 5 core principles. And those principles are: students should be supported to become expert learners by achieving mastery over their learning. And I will explain what mastery specifically means and refers to on the next slide. The role of the teacher or lecturer is to support students in developing mastery, not just to deliver content. Hopefully we are all aware of that by now. Number 3, students are more likely to master their learning in the presence of teachers and peers than they are on their own. Students are more likely to master learning if they learn actively rather than passively. And then finally, this is the kind of bit where UDL really comes in. Students are more likely to master their learning if their learning experience is customizable to their preferences. So this is where we use multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression, so that learners actually have some choice in relation to how they engage with their learning, that have some choice over the types of learning resources that are there to support their learning, and they have some choice in relation to how they demonstrate their understanding. In terms of mastery over learning, I just want to clarify what we mean by that. So mastery of learning content in the way that we define it is basically the capability to do all of the cognitive skills in Bloom's taxonomy, which is on the screen at the moment, but particularly the higher order skills. So obviously being able to do all of these skills is about putting content to work. It's not just about knowing stuff. It's about being able to use various cognitive skills to work with that content. We might call that functional knowledge or functional understanding. And it's really about what you can do with content rather than just the content per se. So mastery for us is getting our students to be able to do all of these things, but particularly the higher order thinking skills, which are the more challenging ones to master. And so this is the cheese sandwich. So as I mentioned, it's an instructional design approach that supports mastery by ensuring that the higher order skills are developed with teacher and peer support. So the orange strip in the middle is the cheese in the sandwich. So this is where that peer and teacher support happens. So which is where we really work on those higher order thinking skills to make sure that students practice them, understand them, get feedback on them, and they're able to take advantage of that time that they spend with their teachers and peers. The lower order cognitive skills can be tackled during self-directed study time, which represents the slices of bread either side of the cheese. So that's the kind of more buff or light cream coloured aspects that you see either side of the cheese in the sandwich there. The idea is that learners find a personalised path to mastery using the UDL principles, which you can see run through the entire cheese sandwich at the top there. And that's effectively what the cheese sandwich is in a nutshell. So when COVID happened and teaching went online, we were concerned that colleagues would forget some of the underpinning ideas around the cheese sandwich as they grappled with learning how to teach online. We were concerned that they may resort to just providing didactic sessions without sticking to the cheese sandwich principles. So basically just replicating what they might have done in a face-to-face environment and just transferring it directly to an online environment. So in response to that, we created a mnemonic to help them remember some of the key ideas around the cheese sandwich when they were designing and delivering their online learning and teaching sessions. So Patterns was created, and that stands for pre-work, alignment, technology, teamwork, engage, evaluate, rewind, no barriers, and support. So I'm not going to go through what each of those things means because you can kind of see that on the screen there. This is effectively about ensuring that we maintain those critical elements of that cheese sandwich approach that I mentioned previously, specifically the engage, evaluate part. So this is where we're getting students to learn actively, we're getting them to learn collaboratively with their peers and obviously with support from the teacher. But the other critical aspect of this particular part is the necessity of feedback. So obviously if you're practicing any skill, whether it's a practical skill or a cognitive skill, you need feedback to know how you're getting on. And if you're not actually performing that skill as it should be performed, you need that feedback to actually make modifications and actually perform it in the right way. So we don't really learn effectively without that need for feedback. And it was really, really critical that we maintain these elements of our approach to learning and teaching when we made the move to virtual online learning and teaching as part of COVID. We didn't want our staff to forget those things because obviously they were really, really important. We launched Patterns as a screencast initially and then as a downloadable quick guide. And since launching it in April 2020, we've had over 1,000 staff access it to support their online teaching. So it's worked pretty well. Staff have been really, really receptive to the ideas presented in it, and it really has helped them to kind of design and deliver their online teaching sessions, particularly those staff that had never taught online before. So I'm just going to run through some key feedback points that we received from staff after we launched Patterns.
Just a minute to go.
Thank you. So in terms of feedback, staff liked Patterns. They said that it helped them to intentionally design online teaching sessions rather than just replicating what they did in the face-to-face environment. They said they liked the checklist-like quality of Patterns, and it provided them with a certain level of comfort and safety going into the unknown world of online teaching. Specifically, colleagues said that they felt Patterns helped improve engagement and collaboration between learners when teaching online, which they were two things that were highlighted as being problematic. And they also had said that this helped to support some of the social interaction elements among learners in the online environment, which was another problem area when teaching online. So again, the fact that this was kind of intentioned was cited as a big help. The fact that actually we were supporting colleagues to intentionally embed this stuff in the online environment rather than just say, well, do what you've always done in the classroom, but just transfer it to the online environment seemed to be a really important step. Anybody that's interested in learning a little bit more about patterns, there's a little reference at the bottom there from the Journal of Learning Development in Higher Education, the paper Instructional Design for Live Online Teaching Using Mnemonics to Support a UDL-Centered Approach, basically tells a more detailed story of this particular journey. And hopefully that's about 10 minutes, I think.
That's just about. Thank you very much, Kevin. So we've got a couple of minutes for questions. So I'm conscious there's another session starting at 11. So if anyone's got any questions, please raise your hand, and then we can come round to you. Or if you prefer to type it into the chat, please do, or comments or questions. Mark.
Thank you, Kevin. That was really interesting and lovely to see how you described the journey that a student would take through their pre-activities and their engagement with their learning. The question I got, and I was writing in the chat actually, but I'll come online and do it, was with regards to their preference for assessment. So you talk very much around their engagement and their preference for learning, but I'd be keen to learn a little bit more around how you enable the learner to have preference over their assessment choice.
So that's a really good question. It largely depends what's being assessed, whether it's mostly knowledge that's being assessed or skills. So obviously if it's a skills-based assessment, so let's say we were taking a public speaking course, then the assessment would have to be a public speaking task. So there wouldn't necessarily be choice in terms of the output, but what we would give choice in relation to in that scenario would be the topic of that public speaking task, for example. If it's more knowledge based, then what we try to do is provide learners with a variety of options of how they can demonstrate understanding. So in higher education, typically we tend to get students producing written outputs to demonstrate knowledge or understanding of a particular topic or concept. But what we wanted to try and do was really focus on the assessment construct. So what is it that this assessment is measuring, and what other ways could we effectively measure that construct aside from writing an essay? So we might often provide an option where a student can do, say, a presentation or have some sort of professional discussion. Some areas weren't always that keen on doing that, particularly if they had a professional and statutory regulatory body that underpinned that particular program. But the idea really is to provide, basically to dissect the assessment and see what the core construct that's being assessed is, and what other ways are there of actually measuring that core assessment construct. And also, how do your current assessments provide additional barriers that could be removed? So, you know, for some students, a written output could be a barrier, particularly students that don't have a great command of English. But if we're just testing their biology knowledge, let's say, is there an alternative that they could use, such as a presentation or a discussion, for example?